everyone, welcome back to Deeper Roots. One of the things that we were taught in Sunday school was how the Pharisees in Jesus' time were very strict with their traditions. So strict even that it potentially conflicted with their own doctrine, and that it prevented them from being able to see that Jesus was their Messiah. They held their traditions so high that it sometimes went over God's law. And that's basically what we're talking about today. At what point does reverence become idolatry? We know that we have things in our lives that must be honored and respected, but at what point does that become more than just respect? When does it become obsession or something that we worship? This question was submitted online, and if you'd like to submit your own question, you can visit our website www.ibbvn.org/deeperroots. That link is in the description. There you can see where we publish our podcasts, and you can submit your own questions using the form on that page. Asking a question online is anonymous, that way you aren't afraid of asking anything that's on your mind. Thank you for joining us today. Let's get to the conversation. Welcome back to Deeper Roots. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Today we have Pastor Luis, and we also have Kevin here again.
Hello.
Today's question is actually a question that Kevin brought up, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it, and he can explain it further if he wants to. But the question is, at what point does reverence become idolatry? Kevin also clarifies, saying, we want to honor or revere our Bible, the apostles, the cross, our traditions, and our image of Christ. But this can easily fall into idolatry. How do we keep ourselves from worshiping the image over the truth? Do you want to clarify anything, Kevin?
Yeah, so at a certain point, what we could believe that some traditions some routines become tradition, and tradition becomes borderline religious. I came across a small little part of a novel I'm reading, and it was talking about how this general had to deal with, traditions, and he talked about it in a little story of how he had to go through it. So this general was with his trainer before he became a general. He was a soldier. He says, all right, so you have to put your belt around your waist 3 times so you could go into fighting, but it's squeezed into death. Something he asked why. The trainer said, well, my trainer told me to do this, and it made us better soldiers for it. The general didn't want to be a disobedient soldier, so he went ahead and did that. But as soon as he went up in ranks, he wanted to go and check and ask his superior, or who was his trainer. And he went and checked with his trainer. And this guy was a little bit larger, but he says, yeah, no, you have to put 3 belts around your body. That's how my trainer told me to.
So like around 3 times.
Around 3 times. Yeah,
okay.
Not 3 belts around. Put the belts around me 3 times. Because my trainer told me that too. All right, so now he's going through different layers. Now he goes to the older generation. He asks, why did you put 3 loops of the belt around your waist to make you squeeze even harder? Now this guy's a large guy. He's like, nope. This is exactly what I need to do as a good soldier. My trainer always did that to me. This guy has always been large, and he's very confused. And he finally goes to the last guy. Now, this guy's living far away in a city now. He's old, and he's retired. So he visits the house, and he says, hey, so why do I need to put the belt 3 times around my waist? The guy gets up. He's a really, really short guy, half the size of his previous trainees, and he says, well, if I don't put the belt 3 times around my body, my pants fall off. It was a really silly picture, a really silly story, but it sort of got me thinking. This guy has been taught so many times from when he was young and the people before him to do things in a way that would only help this guy at first. What part of these traditions we teach as truth are actually truth? And I mean, that's another question altogether, but the point here is, how do we keep these things becoming our faith and stop becoming, like, we have, well...
It becomes idolatry.
It becomes idolatry.
And this is something that, like, the Pharisees also dealt with back in Jesus' time, right? Like they would do things out of the sake of tradition, but then they would think of it like, oh no, but this is the Jewish way. This is like what we're supposed to do to honor God. But they just lose the point of it. So yeah, we're delaying pastor's response, but
just go for it. There we go. It makes me happy. Just kidding. Great question. To be honest, I've never heard this question, so that's good for you to actually ask this. I've heard about tradition and stuff, but the way you phrase it, I've never heard it that way. What point does it become idolatry? Or doing something or traditions, or when can it become idolatry? So I'll give you props for the question, because I've never really dealt with that one. I know the place traditions can play and the way we can fall off the horse on traditions, but yeah, I hadn't thought about it connected to idolatry, how it can actually start becoming more important to us. And then God himself, he can become an idol. So let me just start with a couple of verses. Just we're clear on 1 Corinthians 10:14. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. 1 John 5:21. Dear children, keep yourself from idols. Colossians 3:5. Put to death, therefore, whatever brings to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. So idolatry is something that, again, is very natural in humans' fallen nature, okay, which is basically worshiping or reverencing something above God. And you sort of, in your original question, you said, when does reverence become idolatry?
Yeah, when does reverence become idolatry?
Yeah, so can you give me some example of some things that Christians can end up reverencing to a point that it can become idolatry, at least in your view?
So one of the big ones that's actually been a contention point for a lot of people I talked to was the use of the cross, crucifix. Either people wear it or keep it in their house, but they always want to keep it with them or keep it sacred. Some people could see that as idolatry, but some people call that as tradition. My grandmother gave this to me. You know, she had it with her family, and this was an heirloom. Or this is what reminds me that Christ died for me. And, you know, keeping that icon there and around you could be a form of remembrance. But when people start, you know, where is that middle point? Like, you keep it up in, like, you keep it in your house. It's in the front of your house or in different parts of your house. When does that start becoming an idol? Because we know that Jesus died on the cross. It's an icon. And it reminds us it's not a problem to have, you know, or is it a problem to even have the cross as a remembrance? But
first of all, when it comes to idolatry in the Old Testament, there's a lot of verses where it talks specifically about not making an idol out of anything in heaven, on earth, or under the earth, and reverencing it or having that worship a factor towards it. So when it comes to that, is specifically that example, the crucifix. We as Christians don't use crucifixes as believers, or we could say Protestants. Usually it's more connected to the Catholic Church. And the reason in a Protestant church you won't find a crucifix, which is Jesus hanging on the cross, you'll just find an empty cross, is because of that commandment, that having the image or the sculpture of a Jesus actually hanging from there, whether it's on your metal cross or on the church cross, it is a violation of that commandment, of making a form of something where then you reverence it and you worship. And then you can go into idols, actual idols from the Catholic Church, where you have Mary and an altar to Mary, and you have St. Peter, St. So-and-so, and people worship and bow down to them and pray. And those are clear violations of that, the idolatry commandment, that we are not to bow down, worship anything that is not God. So we shouldn't make ourselves a form or anything to worship it. So then those are more clear examples, and that's why the crucifix is wrong. Now, but then you can dive into more,
just the cross.
Yeah, the grayer areas, which is the cross. Can the cross, me wearing a cross, become idolatrous, where I use it like a good luck charm or whatever? Can coming here to church and looking at the cross and bowing down to it, can that be idolatrous? Yeah, anything that you worship in the place of God becomes idolatry. A rock star could be your idol. Money can be an idol. Yeah. There's so many things that we reverence above God. But I think the spirit of your question is more to deal with us as Christians, that sometimes we can have practices or traditions where it can take so much importance in us that we sort of lose the spirit behind it, and it becomes idolatrous instead of just reverence.
Right.
So can you give me another example? Because I have examples going through my head, but I want to see. You mentioned something this morning about the Bible too.
Yes. So I'm not sure if this is more of how I've heard how the Quran was used, but if anyone's out there that knows more about how people like honor the Quran, please let me know. But people treat the Quran with like this holy reverence, where it needs to be put on a pillow. Your hands need to be clean before you carry it. Exactly. And I've heard comparisons from other people say that we need to treat that way to the Bible as well. We need to put it on the pillow, if not even better. We need to keep it in a sanctuary, like in a place of sanctuary. We must not let other books on top of it. All these different rules that come into place. But at what point does that become idolatry? Yeah. Or is that idolatry in that particular form?
It can become idolatrous, but it's not necessarily. It all depends, like on the heart and the motivation behind it. We're sort of diving into the whole idea of what is biblical principle and what is preference. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of preferences we build up for ourselves that we want to feel like we're being more reverent to the Bible by not putting it on the ground. For example, that's a preference I actually hold. Mm-hmm. I try not to put my Bible on the ground just as a reverence issue with it, or certain things. But and that's a preference, but it's not something that if someone chooses to do it otherwise, that they're going to be sinning. Why? Because the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say thou shalt not put the book on the ground, or thou shalt not stack anything on top of it. Those are just man-made traditions or preferences that need to be dealt as so, that they are preferences. They're not biblical commandments. When we cross that line, where we now treat it as a commandment of God, something that we ourselves choose to do as a preference, I think that's the line where it becomes idolatrous, where we now have traded it to become a commandment of God when it's really a commandment of man. So then we are idolizing maybe not only the action, but we're idolizing ourselves, because we're putting ourselves as the place of God. Let me read this passage, which is like exactly clear on this subject, which is Mark chapter 7. You'll find it in all the four Gospels, but I'm going to read it from Mark. It says, Mark 7, it says, verse 1, Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like washing the cups, the pitchers, coppers, vessels, and couches. When the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with the unwashed hands? He answered and said to them, Well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of man, the washing of pitchers and cups and many other things you do. And he said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your traditions. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me, it is korban, that is a gift for God, then you will no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. Now here we have a clear example of what we see. Yeah. People putting tradition over the commandments of God. And that's the problem. That's human nature. When we start doing that, when we start putting tradition above what God has said, and we start sort of idolizing those things instead of just viewing it as a preference and what it really is, what happens is that then we start becoming pharisaical. We start putting our heart on those things, and we start feeling like I'm more righteous because I don't put my Bible on the ground. I'm more righteous than so and so because I wear a tie to church, and look at them, they came without a tie. Now I'm way more righteous because look, my wife will never put on a pair of pants, and she only wears skirts, so we must be so much righteous, right? You start replacing God's commandments with tradition, and in the end, you start contradicting and failing in the main things that God wants from you, which is your heart, which is your love, which is your faithfulness. And that's what had happened, because that's the example where it says right there that the commandment said you should honor your father and mother, but they were sort of twisting the system so that if they had done certain things, they had a right to not honor them. God never said that. But they had twisted around their tradition so that if it benefited them economically to not honor them and by giving them money, whatever, then they were okay with not doing it. So see, they twisted traditions to benefit themselves. And that's what we tend to do. So yeah, I think that's where the line is, where the moment we start putting that more important than the tradition of men, the tradition of God or the commandments of God, and then we start also calling it a commandment of God instead of just a preference, that's where we start idolizing.
I think that there's a point where, like, when you start thinking that something that you're doing or this object, if you start thinking that this thing has more power than God has, or like has a power that God has, then it becomes idolatry. Like, for example, if you take the Bible, for example, the Bible, like, obviously it is a powerful book, and it can help people, but it does that because it is God's word, not because it's a book, not because of like the paper that they use or anything like that. It's not like a geode or a rock that people hang around their neck because they think that has healing properties. No, like, it's the book itself doesn't. The paper itself doesn't have those magical healing properties to help with your with bitterness, which we talked about in the last episode. It doesn't help on its own. The paper doesn't help with those things, but God does, and God uses this book to help people through their sin, help people through what they're dealing with. But the moment you start thinking like, oh, this Bible is so important that I'm going to that as long as this Bible is safe, I'm okay, then that's not it. Like, there is a heart issue, like Pastor's saying, but it's also kind of a slippery slope. And that's kind of a question that I have. Unless, Kevin, you have another question.
No, I think we answered the question so far. Yeah, I think we're good to go there.
It's sort of like, in Catholic homes, Latin American Catholic homes, it's very common to see a Bible opened up in a home. And that's like, oh, God's blessing here. Honestly, that does nothing for your home. If you have a raggedy Bible because you read it, you study it, and maybe it's even on the kitchen counter and it's not in a place of reverence, that is what honors God. That you're reading the Bible, that you're putting it into practice. There's an indulgence in your life. There. You're indulging it. That is the reverence, where it says, "Do be ye hearers of the word and not just." Be ye doers of the word and not just hearers of the word only. So that is what honors and gives honor to this book, and then. There is place for traditions. I'm not saying traditions are wrong, but we have to treat them as traditions, as preferences. Yeah, they're preferences. And for example, some pastors prefer their members to not use an electronic Bible. That came up last week. But that's a preference, I prefer, the pastor says, I would prefer you guys to use your Bibles, to be able to turn your pages. That's fine. That's a preference, but declare it as such. The moment you start saying, if you use an electronic Bible, you're being irreverent and you're being disrespectful to the Bible, then the Bible doesn't say that. Like you were saying, the power is in the message, not in the physical or the actual.
Power's in the words, not the letters.
Yeah, it's not in the medium that we're.
Never mind. Sorry.
It's not in the medium itself, whether it's But I'm sure there was some kind of argument when the first bounded books came out. I'm sure people were used to the scrolls, and I'm sure people got all in a fuzz about. You guys are using the
book. You have to use a scroll. What's wrong with you?
It's irreverent to not use a scroll. I'm sure there was that kind of argument back then.
Printing it too. I'm very sure there was like a printing issue. Like, no, that needs to be written down.
Yeah.
Can you imagine those kind of things, or even like you said, written down versus printing, or just the fact of having so many copies? It's like when
it dilutes the power. Like it doesn't. No, it's not the force.
Remember, it's like it used to be like one copy per village or whatever, and now everybody has it. It must. It's like there must have been some arguments over that, but we can say for sure nowadays that like having this being accessible to everyone just really opens the door to so many people actually getting to know the Bible and getting to know what it is that they need to do with their lives. Because before, like, you can have we're kind of going on a tangent with the whole topic of the Bible itself and going like with the printing, but like if you think about like how if there's only one Bible per village and the only person who can read it is the only person who can actually read, which is probably like the priest or the pastor in that village, how easily they can change something. But yeah, that's a different topic. So I have another follow-up question. How can I recognize the slope between reverence and reverence to idolatry? How do I recognize that slope?
I think that we talked about that, and where it was once you start substituting what the Bible, like you put your words as what the Bible says. You should wear a tie when you go to church. You need to have New King James Version for your church. I don't want to see ESV.
You're not a Christian if you don't.
If you weren't saved with the King James Version, we talked about that 2 weeks ago 5 weeks ago. I don't know. Can't remember. But we talked about that.
Yeah, that's the line. When you start putting like Jesus said, you substitute the commandment of God for the tradition of men. And when you start doing that, that's where it becomes idolatrous. It's no longer reverence, because it's one thing to have reverence and saying, okay, for example, we choose as a church to have those 10 minutes of prayer before a service on Sunday mornings. That's a preference. There's nothing in the Bible that says you must do that, but it's just we want to quiet down and have some reverence, so that it helps us to be able to get ready. But it's just a man-made thing, and we have to recognize it as such.
Another thing. So this is kind of tangential, but I think it's still relevant. So I'll ask the question, then I'll have an example, sort of an example there. This also kind of applies to non-religious things. How does respect for secular things differ from? How is it different from reverence for religious or Christian things? So the kind of example that I have is like, I'm in the youth group here at the church, and there are points where I can recognize like this person is respecting for example the Bible, or is respecting the things of God in the same way that they would respect things that are outside of the church, and that is to say not much at all, right? How would I be able to help this person understand that this is these are two different ballparks? Like one is like respect for secular things, and one is a reverence to Christ and reverence to Christianity.
Yeah, it goes back to the heart, like you just said. Your heart is far away from me. Your mouth said one thing, and so I think just as a general good habit, I guess, or a good advice would be, we should always excel to give God better than what we do for secular things. I think a lot of that is especially in service. I try to remember to sort of be strict with our ushers when it comes to, if they're not going to be able to make it, at least let us know, because in a secular job you would call and let them know, I'm not going to make it, I'm not going to be there. or I'm going to be late, but sometimes we treat our service or anything that has to do with God as, it doesn't matter. And that's where true irreverence happens. And that is biblical. Why? Because it's in the Bible. In Malachi chapter 1, it says, why don't you go and try to do that with your prince? He says, look at you give me all the second best. You give me what's the leftovers. He says, why don't you try to do that with your prince? And sort of makes a parallel between their service to something secular and their service to God. And he's saying, you guys always treat me with this irreverence. Well, you would never do that with your prince. He says, why don't you go try to do that with your prince, see how it goes? And that's what God is saying to the people there. Because we can, and that's sort of like where I think it is, where we have to remember that as a general rule, it's good to always try to excel in doing better for our service for God than what we will do for our secular areas where we have reverence and respect.
And just to add on to that, it is definitely a heart thing too, because there is something always that's going to be taking the throne of your heart. And what needs to be there is Jesus Christ and God himself. You put him there, and that's where we get the reverence from. If he doesn't treat that person or God there with reverence, he's not on his seat. He's on your seat, and he's on anyone else around his seat, but he's not personally on that person's throne that's in their heart. Exactly. They have something else. Usually, there might be a problem, they might have like severe depression where they have like a lot of things just lose the weight, and their heart is in anarchy. But if they have conviction, they will have something sitting there willing to do something. Even with even if you lose all faith and you lose everything, there will still be somebody standing left there, and that should be God. And that is just a solution of the heart. They won't treat the same thing if they treat God like they treat their shoes, then
it's a matter of the heart. Exactly. Because like you said, a great example, the throne room of your heart. Who's there's only two people that can be sitting there, either God or yourself. And that sort of reveals why it is for some people it's easier to be respectful and to be responsible when it comes to their jobs, but not with things in church. Why? Because the motivation at the work is me. I'm going to get a paycheck. I need that money. It's me. While in the church, it's not really about me. It's about Christ. And if you do things, it's for Christ. And that's where we struggle with that motivation. And unless he's sitting on the throne, all these things are going to automatically fall as second best or second rate, because who's really sitting on the throne is me, not Christ.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
No, but I like the question. That was a good question. Thank you, Kevin.
All right.
Come up with more questions. And just want to thank also the people who are sending in the questions, because it's been a pattern nowadays that we end up not having questions. And then like the day we're about to record it, like we end up just like bam, bam, bam. We got a bunch of questions in. So that's for me. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But for me, that's a sign that the Lord is blessing this ministry, because when we run out of questions, they start pouring in again. Yeah. And you guys, so that means hopefully we can continue answering your questions. So thank you. And like, if you have a question, that probably means that someone else also has a similar question. And considering that this podcast is, someone can reach this podcast from anywhere, I think worldwide, I think that's how far reaching YouTube and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and Spotify is, right? If anyone can reach this podcast, someone in this world who has access to the internet is bound to have the same question, or might be in a similar situation. So if you have a question, don't be afraid to ask it. It's easy to ask a question. You can submit your own question at www.ibbvn.org/deeperroots. The link should be in the description. But we want to thank you for submitting your questions. It's a huge blessing for us, and I'm hoping there'll be a huge blessing for you, the listener, as well. Thank you for joining us again, and I hope that you can, or we hope that you can join us for next week. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Deeper Roots. If you want to submit a question, follow up on something we talked about on the podcast, or you want to find us online, you can go to our webpage, which is ibbvn.org/deeperroots.
Deeper Roots is a ministry of Iglesia Bíblica Baptista Vida Nueva, which is a local church in Castro Valley, California. And you can learn more about us and our church by going to our website, ibbvn.org.